that when we covered sovereignty in week 1, I discussed the UK's special status within the EU. Part of the British government's argument in this referendum is that David Cameron has negotiated a new arrangement with the EU that reinforces this special treatment. What is mentioned in this context is the notion that there have been significant reforms of how the EU currently works, which will benefit the UK. Some of these relate to immigration in the sense of EU migrants' ability to access the UK welfare system. However, the two campaigns offer very different interpretations of what the outcome of this new arrangement is, as we can see in this slide. On the top is the government's interpretation, and this image is once again taken from its official pro-EU leaflet. Tough new restrictions on access to our welfare system is the slogan. You may also have heard David Cameron promoting this deal by using the expression, no more something for nothing. Naturally, the Leave camp have a radically different opinion on the reforms relating to the welfare rights of EU migrants. In the lower image, we have an explanation of one of the original objectives Cameron was hoping to achieve: a 4-year delay on EU migrants' access to in-work benefits, which is not what he got according to the Vote Leave interpretation. In addition, they claim that the deal is potentially subject to review by the European Union's top court, the European Court of Justice, whose decisions are binding on the United Kingdom. So which interpretation is right? To answer this, we first need to understand what was agreed regarding welfare rights for EU migrants. At the moment, nothing has officially been implemented. It's all about what's in the pipeline if the UK stays in the EU. What the February agreement, a copy of which is available as part of the materials for week 1, what it specifies is that the EU will introduce new legislation in 2 areas. Firstly, there will be a law allowing countries to pay child benefit to EU migrants whose children live in another country on the basis of the cost of living of where the child actually resides. That would make it less costly for the UK, as most child benefit going to children living elsewhere in the EU goes to Poland, where life is cheaper. This change will apply to new claimants in the first instance, but from 2020, the UK and other countries can index link for all recipients of child benefit that is exported. However, let's look at the potential numbers of people affected. According to figures from HMRC, as of March 2015, there are 32,408 children living abroad who are in receipt of UK child benefit. To put that into perspective, there are more than 7 million families receiving child benefit in the UK. So the measure would affect a fraction of the overall spending on this form of welfare payment. Note then that the renegotiation does not allow the UK government to simply stop paying out for children living abroad. The second area of future EU legislation on welfare concerns the ability of EU migrants to access so-called in-work benefits. In the UK, these are known as tax credits, which essentially allow workers on low incomes to boost their take-home pay. The concern here is that this creates an incentive for citizens from EU countries with low average pay to seek employment in Britain. Looking at the HMRC figures presented here, you'll see that for 2014, nearly 7% of families receiving tax credits contained an EU citizen from outside the UK. The sums involved here are thus far larger than for child benefit sent abroad, which explains why the government prioritised this particular aspect of welfare policy in its renegotiation. However, the future EU legislation on this topic will not allow the UK government to deny EU migrants access to such benefits for 4 years after moving to Britain. That was David Cameron's original demand, which in theory would make the UK a less attractive destination then for coming to find employment. The compromise reached with the heads of state and government of other EU countries is that access to these benefits could be phased in over a 4-year period for new EU migrants. That would spare some costs for the UK government. But, and this is an important caveat, the British government would not be automatically entitled to phase in things like tax credits over 4 years. Rather, the government would have to apply to the European Commission for permission to do so. According to the text agreed in February, such a request would be granted if there was an exceptional influx of EU migration into a particular member state. In other words, it's a fairly convoluted procedure that, as with the child benefit deal, will depend firstly on getting legislation actually passed. The Leave campaign have a valid point too that there could be a test case brought to the European Court of Justice over these restrictions on welfare entitlement. After all, it is the court's job to decide whether any national or EU law is compatible with the treaties. The reason there could be a legal challenge is because the new arrangements, if passed, the new arrangements for child benefit and in-work benefits could be considered discrimination on grounds of nationality. Free movement of people is, you will recall, all about treating other EU citizens in the same way as one's own nationals. On this point, it's significant that David Cameron got nowhere with his original demands. These included not just a 4-year waiting time for in-work benefits, but also a cap on EU migrants. The story behind this climb down is represented in the following image, which comes from an article in the Daily Express, a British tabloid newspaper. It's clear that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who is presented here as David Cameron's puppet master, was the most important decision maker during the UK renegotiation talks, and she was against any quotas on EU migrants and other forms of overt discrimination. However, in this she had the support of many other EU leaders, in particular those from Central and Eastern Europe. So this is the reality for the UK within the EU. Would it really be different from the outside? That is, as I mentioned last week when discussing the single market, would the UK need to accept free movement of people in order to do a deal on goods and services with the EU? Well, the only way to read the outcome of the renegotiation is to see it as a very strong indicator of the EU support for the principle of labour mobility. That is what the EEA countries, as well as Switzerland, have had to accept in return for doing their trade deals. It's also important to note that Michael Gove, the Leave campaigner who featured in last week discussing trade deals outside the EU, he admitted that being outside the single market is the only way to control immigration because any other deal would involve accepting the free movement of people. This lends itself to another topic for the week's discussion forum. Would you prefer the UK to be able to control immigration instead of being in the single market? What we have seen in this week is that the pro-EU argument over immigration and border control is both defensive and positive. It's positive about security cooperation via EU membership, although this is an area where there are many existing international efforts to share information and resources that do not necessarily depend on being inside the EU. So the heart of the controversy actually surrounds the issue that the Remain camp is defensive about, the free movement of people principle. It's the lack of control over immigration policy that the Leave camp emphasizes. They do so in particular by playing up the risks associated with EU enlargement, particularly concerning Turkey. However, such EU expansion is for the future, and the UK has a veto over the admission of any new member state. Tellingly, the outcome of the UK renegotiation talks also showed how fundamental free movement is to the European Union. At one point, David Cameron was seeking quotas on EU migrants, but this was considered completely unacceptable by his European counterparts. So we can expect the EU to play hardball again on this issue should the UK leave and seek access to the single market. Ultimately, the significance of immigration and border control in this referendum comes down to whether voters prefer control over migration over access to the single market. This dilemma illustrates one of the fundamental ways British voters are currently divided over the EU issue, which is precisely the topic for next week. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to reading your comments in the discussion forums and interacting with you during the next live Q&A.